Morning, it's Dr. Karen. So this morning I am going to talk through a topic that I've just recently covered on the blog, and that is work-life balance for SLPs. So obviously this is something that comes up in a lot of different groups and discussions and is a huge issue for our profession and really a lot of people. And what we hear is a lot of people saying, I just wish I had a work-life balance. I wish I wasn't so stressed. I wish I could fit it all in, and I've got too much stuff to do. And so I wanted to introduce another concept that is sort of an alternative to work-life balance. It's actually better at getting what we truly want, which is to feel less stressed and more adjusted and to be actually able to enjoy life, but not sacrifice performance on any of those things that are important to us. And that is something that's called counterbalance. So what I'm going to do is I've got my post up here on my top screen here. I'm going to share the post here, and I'm going to kind of go through it point by point and talk through all of the different rules and recommendations for this concept. So we're talking about work-life balance, and I wanted to introduce you to a concept called counterbalance that I learned about in the book, The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. And what counterbalance is that it's the opposite of what we try to do when we try to have a work-life balance. So what most people do is that we try to juggle a ton of different things at once. And this isn't just at work, this is in life in general. And what that ends up doing is that we're always kind of going back and forth. And what it ends up making us do is never really doing a good job at any one thing. And it makes us feel stressed and exhausted because we're constantly overcommitted. And a lot of times, if we take a look at our lives, we realize that there are a lot of things that if they didn't get done, it's probably not the end of the world. So part of this is just re-examining your priorities and re-examining what you really think of as this has to get done. There are many things that we could probably compromise on and prioritize over other things and still get the same results. So let me go through the rules of counterbalance, and then I'm going to talk about a couple specific examples to SLPs and how that might apply to your situation. So first, let's go through the 4 rules of counterbalance. Rule number 1 is that we want to have a clear distinction between work and life. I know that when I was an SLP, there would always be times where, sometimes you kind of have to do this, but where you might be like, oh, I've got to call and make this appointment during the day, and then you're doing that during your your 5-minute break between students or whatever. And but then what happens is that there's your work and your life kind of get meshed together, and there's never really a separation. So we're never really fully committed at either place. So when we're at work, we're kind of preoccupied about what's going on at home or what we need to do at home. Or when we're home, we're preoccupied with work and we're sitting behind our laptop. So when we truly figure out a way to counterbalance, we're able to separate work and life. And what that allows us to do is that we're able to take each one of these buckets, our work balance and our life balance, or a bucket, our work bucket and our life bucket, and figure out within those 2 things where our biggest priorities are. So just even making that distinction between what's going on with me in work and what's going on with me in life, and figuring out what are my biggest priorities in each one, that can give you a lot of clarity on where you need to be spending your time. Because what happens with a lot of people is that everything is kind of just lumped into this big bucket, and what they find is that maybe they have maybe they're pretty good at categorizing or prioritizing in one, but not the other. And because of that, one is leaking over to another. So maybe they're good at prioritizing at work, but they're not good at prioritizing at life. So it just feels like everything is super stressful. So the first step in doing this is figuring out just distinct buckets and areas of your life. And you might even have separate buckets within those 2 categories. So for example, in your personal life, you might have your personal, extracurricular, and health, and then you might have your family over here. And even doing that, separating that out into buckets, then you can say, okay, this is my number one thing or my goal that I'm working on now in all of these areas. So that can help you kind of distinguish what your key tasks are during the day. So let's go on to rule number 2. So again, rule number 1 is that we want to clearly distinguish between work and life tasks and not let them mesh together, so that we're not letting one bleed over to the other and just skewing our perception. Rule number 2, on the other hand, is that family and health are never ignored for work. So if we aren't following rule number 1, sometimes this can happen with people who are extreme workaholics. When we don't have those clear delineations between work and life, I know I'm personally guilty of this, where I would have this massive to-do list and nothing on there would have anything to do with my family or taking care of my health. It was all about work. Obviously, what that did was it made my health deteriorate at a certain point in my life, and then I was less able to do everything. So when we don't follow rule number 1, that makes it harder to follow rule number 2 of not ignoring your family and your health. And I wanted to make rule number 2 clear, because when we get into rules 3 and 4, sometimes people tend to misunderstand them. So let me move on. Again, rule number 1, distinguish work and life. Rule number 2, never ignore family and health. And then rule number 3 is intentionally be out of balance. And this is where counterbalance can seem a bit counterintuitive compared to work-life balance. Because when we have truly what the definition of a work-life balance is, we're dedicating equal energy to all things all the time. Multitasking is even kind of a glorified skill, but what it actually does is it makes us divide our focus, makes us less committed to fewer things, which inhibits our performance. We're not able to do as well at those things. And because we're trying to divide our focus, what ends up happening is that it actually ends up taking less energy, because when you're constantly toggling between one thing and another, you lose your focus and you actually lose time. Whereas if you were fully committed to fewer things, or even just one thing at a time, you'd be able to, number 1, perform better, and number 2, be less stressed, because you'd have fewer transitions. There's a reason that a lot of the students that we work with struggle with transitions. It's because transitions are difficult. It's just for them, their tolerance of it might be a little bit lower than ours, meaning that they might act out. For us, we might not act out, but it doesn't mean that it isn't hugely inefficient. So when we're dividing our focus and having to go from one thing to another, that can be very distracting. Perfect example would be, the reason why we have all these laws now about texting and driving, because people are trying to pay attention to a message and they're driving at the same time. We've seen what that does to performance. Same thing goes with even things like therapy. When you are maybe trying to target too many goals at once, maybe trying to jump around from skill to skill without really focusing in on one, we find that we don't do a good job really focusing on any one skill. So when we allow ourselves to really focus on fewer things, what that allows us to do is get to that point where we're actually performing better. We get into kind of that what's considered a flow state, where we really get in the zone and we can really get to that point of improving our performance. So let's move on to rule number 4. So again, rule number 1, separate work from life. Rule number 3, family and health are never ignored for work. Rule number 3, intentionally be out of balance, meaning that sometimes we're not focusing on certain things at all. We're not trying to juggle everything at once. We're trying to fully commit to fewer things, which means that, on our priorities, it might look like this. We might be really focusing on this and totally ignoring this for the sake of giving ourselves the opportunity to really do a good job on this over here. Rule number 4, don't stay out of balance too long. So obviously, you know, let's use the texting and driving example. We shouldn't text while we drive. We should fully focus on driving until we're done driving, but maybe that text is important. Maybe you need to respond to that person and communicate that with them. So we can't stay out of balance too long. Yes, we should, in the short term, focus on one thing over here and ignore this, but we can't stay out of balance and only focus on this one thing. You know, we can't just focus on driving. Sometimes we need to stop to eat and answer our phone or go to the bathroom, whatever. We don't want to stay out of balance too long. Another example would be with therapy. I gave the example of really honing in on just 1 or 2 goals and really getting those, doing a really good job with those. Well, obviously we can't do that forever. Eventually we do need to cycle in other things. So the key to a successful counterbalance is fully committing to fewer things, but knowing when it is time to switch and make that transition. So it's finding that happy medium between having too many transitions and being rigid and only focusing on one thing. Because obviously, if you only focus on one goal all year, you might miss out on some things that students need to work on. So let's go through those rules one more time. Rule number 1, separate work and life. Rule number 3, never neglect family and health. Or sorry, rule number 2, never neglect family and health. Rule number 3, intentionally be out of balance. It's okay to ignore things. It's okay to eliminate things. That's what successful people do. But don't do it too long. So rule number 4, don't stay out of balance too long. That's how we successfully are able to separate work and life without totally neglecting things. Obviously, let's say that a perfect example is people who have to leave their kids to go to work. Well, in order to be a good parent and provide that stable home for your kids, you do have to leave them with a babysitter, or take them to school some of the time, and then really focus on work and not focus on them for some of the time so that you can provide some stability for them. But, you know, if you're at work constantly on the phone about your kids, your work performance is going to suffer. You might not perform as well at work. You could not be as successful in your career. And that's going to cause some negative consequences in other areas of your life. Same with the other way around. We can't focus on work too long. Eventually, we do need to put work down and focus on our family so that we can be there for them. And because otherwise, you know, what's the point of working if you're not gonna have a life to enjoy all of those benefits of whatever you're getting from that job. So let's talk a little bit about how this applies to SLPs. So I gave some specific examples already. And I wanted to just share a couple other resources with you. Before I get into specific examples, I wanted to share a couple links. Number 1, I mentioned that a lot of times in therapy as SLPs, we feel like, and this is especially, I talk a lot about language therapy. I talk a lot about how, you know, sometimes you don't want to half-ass 2 things or 30 things or whatever. You want to whole-ass one thing, meaning it's okay to cut down on the number of goals that you're working on, because what happens is that there are certain skills, especially when it comes to language, that are more impactful than others. So you can actually eliminate some of those skills that you're working on and do a really good job focusing on fewer skills and make more headway, because not only will you be giving your students enough time to actually make progress on those skills, but you're actually going to have an impact on some of those skills some of those other skills that you're trying to work on. So I wanted to share a webinar that is coming up here. So I do have a live webinar coming up on the 15th and 16th. However, I also have the same webinar pre-recorded that's always going. I'm going to share the registration page for the live version in the comments. And what I'm going to show you in this webinar is essentially how to counterbalance when you're doing language therapy. So, and the ultimate goal is that we want to figure out the highest priority skills and eliminate the rest so that we can do a really good job cycling through the key skills. But obviously there's a subtle balance because we can't literally just focus on one language skill all the time. So in this webinar, I am going to talk about how to do that for language, and ultimately what it is cutting down on the number of skills that you're working on and focusing on the skills that give you the biggest bang for your buck. And what we have found is same thing with the concept of counterbalance. When you are trying to do all the things and you're jumping from one thing to another, you're not giving your students enough time to really make progress with any one skill. So this would be students who, you're focusing on reading comprehension, WH questions, and you're focusing on categories, and you're focusing on synonyms and antonyms, and then you're drilling their science and social studies vocabulary. And it's like, you can never get to it all. Well, the good news is that you don't have to. So in that webinar, I'm going to talk about how you can hit fewer skills with greater intensity and actually get better results. I will mention in that webinar my course, Language Therapy Advanced, because in that course, I really dive deep and give the specific strategies for all the things that I talk about on the webinar. So I dive deeper into that framework and show you exactly how to counterbalance so that you are focusing on the right language skills, but you're also cycling through them. So essentially what you're doing is that you are figuring out how to intentionally be out of balance in your language therapy by eliminating some of this other stuff, but not doing it too long, knowing when it is time to cycle through the next skill. So that's how we would do it with therapy. So ultimately what you want to do when you're trying to figure out how to apply this to your job as an SLP, one key way we can do that is by the way that we write our goals and plan our therapy, because if we are focusing on fewer goals and doing it better, and we're making sure that those goals are the things that are the most impactful and that those skills and strategies are the most impactful, what that does is that it can cut down a massive amount of time on our data collection because we're not trying to track a million goals. And it can make writing reports a lot simpler because we weren't focusing on all of the things. We're just reporting on the most important things. And the best part is that you're going to have more of a pulse on what's going on with your students because you're more focused. You've got more of a streamlined system. So the more that we can create systems and be really clear on exactly what we need to do during our therapy time, the more that we can actually cut down on the stress. And the other thing too is that when you have fewer goals, a lot of SLPs will, number one, complain about the paperwork. Having fewer goals and having a clearer focus in therapy is going to make your paperwork easier because you're not going to be sitting there thinking like, how do I write this? What data do I write? It's going to be a lot clearer, but that's also going to make planning a lot clearer because if you have fewer things that you're working on and you've got a set of staple activities, you're not going to have as many decisions to make. The key is that we want to cut down on the number of decisions that we need to make when it comes to planning therapy. And that is ultimately how we're able to do what I was mentioning before, which was figure out within our work bucket. Again, remember rule number one, separate work and life. Within our work bucket, if we're clearer on what we're doing in therapy and what our goals are, that's going to make it easy for us to look at what we need to do that day and figure out what our key priorities are. If you feel like you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off in therapy, it's going to be a lot harder to figure out what your priorities are. So I got a great question yesterday from a reader because in this article that I shared, I talked about how people who are successful do things in big batches. And so that's why a lot of times when we are planning, we do want to try to plan instead of doing a little bit at a time, or instead of with data collection, instead of doing it a little bit at a time, or same with reports. If we take one task and focus a big chunk of time on it instead of trying to do all of your tasks on all of your days, then that's fewer transitions, and that means you're going to be more efficient. You're going to be able to get in the zone with that particular task more easily. So that is how it would work with things like therapy planning, data collection, paperwork, writing reports, all of those things. So I do recommend batching. So instead of trying to do a little bit at a time, try to get bigger chunks of time so that you can really get into that zone and be able to work more effectively during those time periods. However, I got a great question, and this is a great point, because a lot of SLPs are in this boat. A reader said, hey, what if, because I recommended in my article, okay, you could do data days, like do your data collection in big batches, because legally, according to federal guidelines, you aren't required to take data in every session. For a lot of states, depending on where you are, the IEP or your therapy plan dictates when you need to fill out that progress report, and that also can inform how often you take data. So you technically don't have to take data on all the goals, all the days, or even take data every day. But some districts or states, and a lot of times it might just be a district policy, and you're going to want to be aware of this, will say you've got to take data every single session. So I would recommend, if you be very, very clear on what you absolutely have to do. And this is not about half-assing things. This is about making things more efficient, because what that allows you to do is on some days be really focused on getting that good data, and then on other days be fully present with your students and do good therapy. And so I do recommend, and however much people say, how often do I do it? Well, do it however often you need to in order to still be able to make good treatment decisions and have a pulse on what's going on with your students. And again, that's going to be easier if you have fewer goals. However, if you are in a district for whatever reason, and again, be really clear on this, because sometimes people feel like they have to do things, but when they really dig into the guidelines, they realize they really don't. I know there were a lot of things in my district. They were like, well, we want you to do it this way, but there wasn't any ramifications if we didn't do it that way. And I did it the way that I thought was best for my students, and I never got in any trouble. But you want to be clear on your guidelines. If you are in a district where you truly have to have data for every session, what I recommend doing is same model where you really, really hone in on data like once a month or once a quarter. And during those weeks, what you can do is that sometimes in order for you to maybe give yourself a big chunk of time or even give yourself evaluation time, you might have to combine groups. And the concern was, well, I either have to try to make that time for myself, which means grouping kids together and having these huge groups, then that really sucks for students because I can't focus on goals as well. Or I need to make my schedule crazy for myself and then never give myself paperwork time. So what I would recommend doing is, it's fantastic if you are in a district that will allow you to trial something like the 3-to-1 model or a version of it, where you have a rotation where you're doing direct therapy and then some days you're doing consult observations and data collection. I have seen different variations of this where it's 3 weeks on with therapy, 1 week off, or I've even known an SLP locally who crammed her therapy into 4 days, and then Fridays were totally open, and she would see makeups, she would pull kids in to take data, and she's like, yeah, Monday through Thursday is crazy, but it is so worth it, and my life is like, I know I'm going to be back to back, but that way I'm all in on therapy for those 4 days, and then that 5th day I have. If you can't do something like that, I would even recommend trying something like doing something that mirrors the 3-to-1 model, but maybe on those off weeks, what you do is sacrifice therapy just in those weeks to get your data in the interest of knowing, of having a pulse on how your students are doing. So for example, you might have your ideal schedule for 3 weeks in a row, or it doesn't even have to be 3 weeks. It could be like every 4 or 5 weeks. You've got your ideal schedule for therapy those weeks. And, you know, maybe your groups are spread out and it doesn't give you a lot of data collection time. And then maybe plan a week where you combine some groups, and that's the good week to try to focus on carryover and just kind of let your students see what they can do, and maybe combine your groups on those weeks in the interest of giving yourself more flexibility to do all of those things that you don't normally have time to do. And you know, okay, this week I'm focused on data collection, I'm focusing on observation and consultation. My groups are going to be a little bigger. I'm not going to be able to hone in on some specific individualized instruction just those weeks, but that's okay, because all this other time I'm going to be able to really hone in on it, and I'm going to actually get even better therapy. The problem is that if we try to do like if you're trying to do the paperwork all the time and have the ideal groups all the time, and we're never focusing on making one thing a priority, we are really stressed and we don't do a good job at either one. So I would say it's okay to take a week and make data collection your priority. And then the other times, I don't want to say half-ass your data collection, but if you've got to take data every day, just write something and do the best you can, knowing that maybe it's not the best data, knowing that, you know, this 1 week I'm going to focus on getting really good data. You know, and I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it where you are taking some data every day. Typically, I mean, honestly, it's really unrealistic and not even in the student's best interest for you to have to take data on every single goal every day. Because that's just not how, especially with language, that's not how language works. You might be cycling through different skills and not necessarily taking data on the same thing every day. My perfect example I will give, if you watch that webinar or if you decide to take my course, Language Therapy Advanced, is that there are a lot of skills, like a lot of us are working on reading comprehension and WH questions. There are a lot of foundational skills that you need to build in your students for them to even be able to have the language skills necessary to comprehend, to have that high level comprehension. So that means that a lot of times people are like drilling reading comprehension and they're not making progress with their students because their students don't have these foundational skills. So that means that there might be some days when you don't even work on reading comprehension or WH questions or stating the main idea. But that's because you're working on other things that are going to improve that. And if you keep working over here, you're kind of throwing your kids into the deep end without teaching them how to swim. And we don't want to do that. So that's why it's actually better to sometimes back up and not always be working on all of the skills all of the time, because your students might need those foundational skills. So it's okay to just hone in on that. So that's how I would recommend handling that. Thank you for everybody who did ask questions, because a lot of times with this concept of counterbalance, a lot of people will read it and think, because again, the title of this article is Work-Life Balance Doesn't Exist for SLPs, and that's a good thing. And some people are like, what? What does that even mean? That doesn't even make any sense. And that's because with counterbalance, the whole point of what people think they want with the work-life balance is, I just want to be less stressed. I want to be able to do a good job at work, but then also not be totally drained at home. But the problem is that when we truly are balancing all these things at once, we're not going to have that. It actually makes us more stressed and we're just overcommitted. What we want to do is have that counterbalance, which means fully committed to fewer things. And then that's truly what's going to enable you to actually feel what you truly want to achieve by saying that you want a work-life balance. And so there's a lot of links in this article. Again, I highly encourage you to check out The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. That's in that article. I've got some links to it. And there's even a shortened version of a blog post that just says, The Lie of a Balanced Life. And this was kind of this was a game changer for me. And then even Ron Swanson said, don't half-ass two things, whole-ass one thing. So that's essentially what we're doing here. But again, a lot of people, when they hear me say counterbalance, and I even had when I was mentoring students doing their dissertations, I was saying, you know what, hey, it's okay to say, hey, I got to write today. Like, I'm not going to be home and like have somebody come over and watch the kids or whatever it is. It's okay to do that. It's okay to give your permission to ignore other things temporarily. What people think that I'm saying is ignore things, neglect these areas of your life, burn yourself out. That's the whole point of counterbalance, is that if you focus on fewer things and you allow yourself to truly get into that flow state, it's not that much effort to get through some of these things. I mean, we've all sat there and tried to do paperwork before, and we're like, my brain just doesn't work and I can't get it out. And I do a lot of writing. I mean, you guys know how much I write emails. Like, I write a lot every day. I don't always feel like writing when I sit down to do it, but I do my writing in big batches. And I did that when I was, when I would write my language reports or do my paperwork or do my planning or data collection, all the examples that I gave. And even with the way that I structured my blocks of what I was working on in therapy, what that allowed me to do was when you allow yourself to kind of get over that hump, like when we first start writing, we never feel like it. And then you kind of get in the flow as you're going. But if you're only giving yourself little short chunks of time, you never get to that state. So you always feel that anxiety of like that forced feeling where the words won't come out. But if you get yourself to that state of like a flow and things start to move a little bit, then then it's a lot easier to get work done. It's kind of like when you're working out and you don't feel like doing it, but then once you get warmed up and you're like, oh, I'm okay, or like when you wake up in the morning and you feel like crap and you want to just go back to bed, but then you get up and you're like, okay, now that I've gotten over that hump, I'm okay now. Like, I can keep going. So, I mean, there's a lot of different examples, but I would challenge you to think about work-life balance a little bit differently than you have been, and think about what you really want when you say, I want a work-life balance. And all these things on my to-do list, do they really need to get done? Or can I separate into these work and life buckets and maybe eliminate some of these things? And then if you want to really hone into that work bucket, because as we know, work can totally spill over into our personal life if we let it. If you want to figure out how to have that counterbalance in your language therapy, highly recommend that you check out that webinar. As you know, I've got that same webinar going on recorded all the time. And that's just because I know everybody's got a busy schedule. I want it to be available to you whenever, but I also find a lot of value in hopping on here live so that I can answer your questions live. So that's why I am going to do that presentation live on September 15th at 6 p.m. Central Time. So that's Sunday, not this Sunday, but the next. And then I'm going to be doing an encore of that same presentation on September 16th at 8 p.m. I will still have the recording available, but I am offering this live presentation because I just want to be able to hang out with all of you wonderful SLPs live and be able to answer your questions and support you that way. And so, again, I'd love to have you show up live so I can answer your questions. So the registration link is in the comments. The link to that article is also in the comments. And yeah, this is I pretty much wrapped up the topic today. So thank you everyone who has tuned in live this morning. And thank you for all of your questions about work-life balance and about any other SLP related issue that has come up the last couple weeks. Again, when I share information like this, and you've got follow-up questions, I love to be able to dive deeper because a lot of times maybe I addressed an issue, but then there's always those other things that come up where it's like, hey, what about this scenario? So I'd love to get your questions so that I can figure out how to tailor this content to your needs. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. Obviously this recording will be up on my Facebook page, so feel free to share it with your friends or share those links with your friends. So everybody, we're going to wrap up. Everyone have a wonderful Wednesday, and feel free to sign up for that webinar or check out that blog post. Have a good day, everybody.